The night my family's usual way of life was turned upside down is forever etched in my memory. My grandfather, Warren Allison, owner of a thriving ranch, decided to sell his property for a substantial $3.8 million. However, he kept not a single cent of that amount for himself. He transferred all the proceeds from the sale to my father, Mark, demonstrating boundless trust in him. The only request my grandfather made to my father was simple and touching. He looked at him with his tired eyes and said, "Take care of me." That was the sole condition of the deal. Yet, money, as is well known, has an uncanny ability to reveal people's true nature. My father swore he would protect my grandfather, ensure him a carefree old age, and surround him with care. My mother, Elaine, with her inherent faith in her husband, smiled genuinely, trusting his every word. She had always been a pillar of support for her spouse, ready to share any hardship with him. And I, Caleb, watched it all unfold, trying to maintain faith in my father despite the nascent doubts and a premonition of impending trouble. Initially, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then came that ill-fated winter night, gripped by frost and a biting wind. My father, the man to whom my grandfather had unconditionally entrusted his fortune and future, mercilessly cast him out into the street as if he were nobody and deserved no respect. This image is forever burned into my mind, my grandfather, standing on the back porch, wrapped in an old coat, shivering from the cold, his breath turning into clouds of vapor in the frosty air, while my father slammed the door shut in front of him with a loud thud. In that tragic moment, I made an important decision. I took in my grandfather, offering him shelter and care, while his own son disowned him. A few months later, my grandfather passed away in my arms. I naively believed that the pain of his loss would be the hardest part of this story. How wrong I was. When we gathered in the lawyer's office to hear my grandfather's last will, something happened that stunned everyone present. All my life, I believed my grandfather, Warren Allison, was the strongest and wisest man in the world. He wasn't just a ranch owner, he was the soul of our family, its heart and foundation. His cattle ranch stretched for miles across the endless plains of northern Wyoming. It seemed the fences enclosing the property disappeared beyond the horizon, and the sky above the ranch was somehow especially high and boundless. I spent my childhood running across these vast spaces, helping to feed calves, chasing cats, and listening to my grandfather's booming voice, carried on the wind as he gave instructions to the ranch hands. Grandpa was a strict and demanding man, but his sternness was always combined with incredible kindness and sensitivity. He never raised his voice at me. When I made mistakes, he didn't scold me. Instead, he patiently guided me toward the right path. One time, when I carelessly left the barn door open and a calf escaped, I was sure I was in for a severe punishment. But instead of yelling and scolding, Grandpa knelt down, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "Caleb, a man learns best from his mistakes. The main thing is to recognize your fault and correct it." We went together to find the calf, safely returned it to its stall, and I remembered that lesson for the rest of my life. My father, Mark, was a completely different man. He was ambitious, calculating, and always thought about material gain. Where my grandfather saw the meaning of life in the land and livestock, my father saw only numbers and potential profit. He also grew up on the ranch, helping my grandfather with chores, but he never seemed to have much interest in it. Even as a child, I noticed a hidden resentment and dissatisfaction in him. He chafed at the long working days, the dirt under his nails, the endless chores, and the unpredictability of ranch life. Mom often told me that Dad dreamed of breaking free from this routine, achieving more, finding something easier and more profitable. He didn't want to repeat his father's fate. My mother, Elaine, served as a kind of link between these two very different men in my life. She was a quiet and modest woman, but possessed inner strength and wisdom. She always supported Dad in all his endeavors, but at the same time, she loved and respected Grandpa boundlessly. She grew up in a small town nearby and married Dad early. She often said that Grandpa had replaced the father she lost at a young age. In the evenings, she loved to sit with him on the porch, sipping sweet tea, enjoying the sunset, and listening to his fascinating stories like precious treasures. I was 22 when my familiar world began to crumble before my eyes. Grandpa was already over 70, and although his spirit remained as strong and unyielding as ever, his body was gradually weakening. Years of hard labor, early mornings, and harsh Wyoming winters had taken their toll. I noticed his hands trembling when he picked up a cup of coffee and how his steps became shorter. He tried not to show his weakness, pretending everything was fine, but I saw that it was getting harder for him. He was proud, and pride is an inherent trait of men like him. One fateful day, the old man made a decision that astonished everyone. Gathering the family around the kitchen table, he announced in a calm but firm voice, "I'm selling the ranch." The words struck like thunder, leaving everyone stunned. This piece of land, belonging to their family for centuries, was not just a home but an invaluable legacy. A barely concealed fire flared in my father's eyes, an expression I couldn't understand at the time. "Dad, are you sure?" my mother asked softly, hoping for a retraction. "Absolutely sure," Grandpa replied. "The ranch deserves a better fate than to fade away with me. I want my loved ones to be taken care of." A few weeks later, the formalities were settled, and the ranch changed hands. On the day the deal closed, Grandpa invited his family to the lawyer's office. Sitting beside him, I witnessed the old man hand my father every last penny, $3.8 million, keeping nothing for himself. He completely entrusted his future to his son. "Mark," Grandpa said softly, looking my father in the eyes, "I'm giving this to you. I don't need wealth. I only ask that you take care of me. That's all I need." My father smiled and clapped the old man on the shoulder. "Of course, Dad. You have nothing to worry about. You've earned your rest." At first glance, the deal seemed perfect. My father received the funds to realize his ambitions, and my grandfather had the opportunity to enjoy a well-deserved rest. However, a sense of unease lurked in my heart. I remembered the expression in my father's eyes when the money was in his hands. It wasn't gratitude or love, but a greedy hunger capable of blinding a man and eclipsing everything else. Trying to ward off bad premonitions, I convinced myself that I was being overly suspicious. I told myself that my father would keep his promise because Grandpa trusted him. And if Grandpa believed in him, then I should try to as well. Focusing on my own life, I scraped by with odd jobs, dreaming of saving up for college. But out of the corner of my eye, I watched my father and how he managed his newfound wealth. Initially, everything went well. My father bought a bigger house, a better truck, and new furniture for my mother. He made investments and spoke proudly of building a bright future for the family. He settled Grandpa in the guest room of the new house, but gradually a crack began to appear in their relationship. My father's patience with Grandpa wore thin. The once respected man, who had given everything, became a burden in his son's eyes. No one realized then that the decision to give everything away was the spark that ignited a flame of betrayal that would be impossible to extinguish. Grandpa entrusted his son with everything he had, believing that love would be enough, that blood ties guaranteed loyalty. He didn't suspect that the same blood could run cold, and soon they would all learn just how cold a father's heart could become. I tried to believe that my father would keep his word. Grandpa had given him everything, and that had to mean something. For a while, it seemed so. Grandpa settled into the guest room, and my father emphasized at every opportunity how well he was taking care of him. He proudly talked about it at church, at family gatherings, and even to neighbors who stopped by to admire the new truck. But behind closed doors, a different reality reigned. The first signs of trouble appeared in small things. My father would sigh loudly when Grandpa asked for help with simple tasks, like getting a glass from the cupboard or bringing medicine. "You can do it yourself," he would grumble under his breath, thinking no one heard. But I heard, and Grandpa did too. A flicker of pain would cross his eyes, which he tried to hide behind a weak smile. One evening after dinner, Grandpa accidentally spilled water on the table. My father's reaction was immediate and cruel. "For crying out loud, Dad, can't you even hold a cup?" he yelled. "You're like a child." My mother tried to smooth things over, wiping up the spilled water and assuring that it was nothing serious. But the wound had been inflicted. Grandpa sat silently, looking at his calloused hands. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. Before, I hadn't noticed the changes in my father. However, as time went on, the bitterness of disappointment that had settled in my father's soul grew into something sharper and more painful. Evenings became a time for his late returns, which he explained to my mother as urgent business meetings. In the rare moments he was home, he sought any excuse to avoid interacting with Grandpa. My father's speech increasingly featured the dismissive old man instead of the respectful dad, which hurt me. The man who had given him millions, the one who had laid a solid foundation for their family's well-being, had become an unwelcome burden in his own son's eyes. One night, I found my father in his study surrounded by a pile of papers. "Why do you treat Grandpa like that?" I asked. "He gave you everything. Don't you feel a debt of respect towards him?" My father looked up at me, his eyes cold. "Respect doesn't pay the bills, Caleb. He chose to give me that money himself. It was his choice. I didn't ask him for it, and now he expects me to forget about my own life and coddle him. That's not going to happen." My father's words felt like a blow. "He's your father," I said quietly. "One day you'll bitterly regret this." My father leaned back in his chair and let out a bitter laugh. "Regrets don't build a future. You're still young and don't understand. Life isn't about sentiment. It's about moving forward. And sometimes progress requires leaving the weak behind." I left the study, feeling a rising nausea. I wanted to believe that some shred of love still lived in my father, but his words echoed like a death knell in my head. The last straw came during the harshest week of winter. Snowdrifts covered the ground, and an icy wind howled outside the windows, tormenting the house. The heating system worked at its limit, but the rooms were still chilly. One night, I was woken by loud voices coming from downstairs. Creeping to the stairs, I heard my father's angry shout, "I'm tired of this, Dad. I've done enough. You can't go a night without complaining. I'm not your caretaker. You're dragging this family down." Grandpa's voice, trembling but full of dignity, replied, "I gave you everything I had, Mark. I only asked for a roof over my head and a little kindness. Is that too much to ask of a son?" My father's reply was full of venom. "Yes, it is. I didn't ask for this responsibility. I didn't want it. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." Then came the sound of the back door flying open, and a blast of icy air rushed into the house. I rushed down the stairs and saw my father pushing Grandpa onto the porch. The old man stumbled, trying to hold onto his coat, while clouds of white vapor escaped from his mouth. My father's face was emotionless, as if carved from stone. "Find somewhere else to go," he said, and slammed the door shut. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart torn between the father who raised me and the grandfather who taught me true love. The silence became unbearable. Then Grandpa turned around, and his eyes met mine through the glass. The old man's lips were blue, and his body trembled from the cold. At that moment, I knew I could no longer stay silent. Grabbing my coat, I ran outside and hugged my grandfather. "You're coming with me," I said firmly. The old man tried to object, whispering, "I don't want to be a burden, Caleb." But I wouldn't listen. "You're not a burden. You're my family, and I'll take care of you, just like you took care of me." Behind us, lights flickered in the house windows. Shadows moved behind the curtains, where my father stood watching. I didn't care. That night, I chose Grandpa over my father. I chose love over greed. And I knew that choice would change everything. As I led Grandpa away from the porch into the freezing night, I had no idea how much my life would change. I wasn't thinking about money, family feuds, or the consequences of defying my father. My only thought was of the man trembling beside me, the man who had carried me on his shoulders as a child, who had taught me how to mend fences and care for cattle, who had given his only son everything he owned in exchange for a promise of care. That promise had been broken, and I couldn't let the old man face the cold alone. Completely alone, we walked to my old pickup truck, parked on the side of the road. The engine sputtered to life, spewing clouds of smoke, and the heater seemed to barely push out a faint stream of warm air. Grandpa, huddled in his old coat, sat beside me, his hands trembling not just from the biting cold, but from deep exhaustion. For the first few miles, we both remained silent. The quiet between us was thick, like an impending cloud, but not oppressive. It was the silence of two people wounded by life, whose hurts couldn't be healed by words overnight. Finally, Grandpa broke the prolonged silence. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "You don't have to do this, Caleb. I won't be offended if you take me back." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "I'm not taking you back. You're staying with me. You deserve better than what he did to you tonight." He slowly shook his head, as if disbelieving his ears. I never thought I'd live to see the day my own son would throw me out. I guess I was a fool to trust him so much. I glanced at him in the dim light of the dashboard. His face looked haggard and weary. "You weren't a fool, Grandpa. You believed in him because he's your son. There's no foolishness in that. That's love. But he made his choice, and now it's my turn." I brought him to my humble apartment above the hardware store where I worked part-time. It was small, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, but it was warm and cozy, and it was our sanctuary. That night I gave him my bed and settled on the sofa myself. He tried to object, but I wouldn't listen. "You raised me to be a man," I told him, "and a man does what's right." The following weeks were difficult. To support both of us, I had to take a second job at a nearby gas station. I spent long hours stocking shelves, pumping gas, and running delivery errands. Money was tight, but I stretched every penny. Our food was simple and plain: beans, rice, awas, bread, and occasionally meat if I could save enough. Grandpa never complained. On the contrary, he often apologized for the inconvenience. One evening, as I placed 2 bowls of soup on the table, he quietly said, "I feel like I'm dragging you down, Caleb. You should be living your own life, not wasting away here taking care of me." I sat across from him and shook my head. "You're not dragging me down at all. You're giving me the incentive to try even harder. Taking care of you isn't a burden, it's an honor. You gave me so much more than I could ever repay. This is the least I can do." Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "You've been more of a son to me than my own ever was." That moment solidified our bond in a way I never could have imagined. We became a true team, building a new life together. In our free time, I took him on short walks around the neighborhood. His steps were slow and unsteady, but he never gave up. On days when I was home, we would sit by the window, and he would tell me stories about the ranch, about early morning cattle brandings, about fierce blizzards that nearly carried away entire herds, and about nights spent under the starry sky with only a blanket and a faithful horse for company. "Those were tough times," he said one afternoon with a nostalgic voice, "but I'd live them again without a second thought. Hard work strengthens a man, while an easy life makes him soft." I listened, soaking in every word. Then I understood that these weren't just stories, but valuable lessons passed down through generations like family jewels. He wanted me to carry the spirit of the ranch through life, even if nothing was left of the land. As winter gave way to spring, I noticed his health deteriorating. The tremor in his hands grew stronger, and sometimes it was difficult for him to get out of bed. Despite this, he never complained. He would greet me with a smile when I returned from work, even if his body ached with pain. And every night before bed, he would say, "Thank you, Caleb. You have no idea how much this means to me." It was then that I became completely convinced I had made the right decision. I couldn't change my father's actions, but I could honor my grandfather's memory with my choice. It wasn't the size of our dwelling or the balance of our bank account that mattered, but that he knew he wasn't alone, and someone still cherished him. The loss of the ranch was a painful blow for Grandpa, but he maintained his inner strength and sense of dignity, which made him even more valuable in my eyes. The decision to take in Grandpa was not easy. There were moments of despair when it seemed my strength was running out. Exhaustion crept in, threatening to overwhelm me. But a glance at Grandpa, sitting by the window and quietly humming an old tune, brought back memories of my purpose and renewed my resolve. He was not just a relative, but a mentor, a loyal friend, and my only family. And despite all difficulties, I swore to be by his side until the very end. This choice, which seemed simple, became a turning point in my life. I didn't realize then that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every humble meal shared between us was leading to a moment that would shake my family to its core. When the time came to say goodbye and Grandpa's last wishes became known, the decision I had made changed everything. The months we spent together were both the hardest and the most significant of my young life. Every day, I felt the weight of responsibility, but along with it grew a sense of pride. Pride in being able to repay the man who had once given me everything. Grandpa had lost his ranch, but he maintained his dignity until his last days, and I cherished that above all else. The morning I feared most arrived. A ringing silence filled the apartment. Usually there would be the soft shuffling of slippers or a light cough as Grandpa headed to the table, where fresh coffee always awaited him. But that morning, there was nothing. Entering the bedroom, I saw Grandpa lying motionless in bed, his hands folded on his chest. His breathing stopped. I knelt, unable to move, hoping for a miracle, wishing it was just another dream. But when I touched his hand, I felt the cold. Tears streamed down my face. Through my sobs, I whispered words of gratitude for everything. The funeral was modest, but drew many people who genuinely respected the deceased. Former ranch hands, neighbors, and distant relatives came to say goodbye. My father stood at the front with my mother, concealing his true feelings behind a mask of impassivity, but nervous glances at his watch betrayed his impatience. He wanted to conclude the ceremony quickly and move on to what he considered more important matters. I stood by the coffin, immersed in memories of the stories Grandpa had told, the lessons he had taught, and the boundless love he had given until the very end. After the funeral, the family was invited to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. In a tense atmosphere, they sat around a massive oak table. My father leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, confident that he would leave wealthier than before. My mother sat beside him, nervously fidgeting with her fingers and casting anxious glances. I, still overcome with grief, sat opposite, indifferent to material matters and only wanting this story to conclude. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with a calm voice, cleared his throat and opened the envelope. Warren Allison left clear instructions regarding his estate, he began. To his son, Mark Allison, he bequeaths the $3.8 million received from the sale of the ranch, on the condition that he provide his father with dignified care, shelter, and attention until the end of his days. My father's smirk widened. He shot me a glance as if to say, "See, it was always meant for me." But the lawyer wasn't finished. However, he continued, adjusting his glasses, Mr. Allison included a clause that comes into effect if at the time of his death he was not under the care of his son, but of another person. In such a case, all property immediately and entirely transfers to that person. Silence fell in the room. My mother gasped. My father's smug smile was replaced by an expression of extreme astonishment. The lawyer looked at me. According to witness testimonies and medical records, for the last months of his life, Warren Allison resided with and was cared for by his grandson, Caleb Allison. Therefore, in accordance with the terms of the will, all property is to be transferred to Caleb. The phrase hung in the air like a hammer blow. My father abruptly rose from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. He gave me the money. It was his decision." The lawyer remained unperturbed. Indeed, it was his choice, but he also set conditions. He stated clearly, and I quote, "The fortune will be squandered in selfish hands. Let it go to the one who shows me love when I have nothing left." These words are written in his own hand. I stood frozen, as if struck by lightning, thoughts swirling in my head. I had never sought wealth. My only desire was to ease Grandpa's last days. And now, I unexpectedly became responsible for the fruits of his labor, for what my father had squandered. Tears glistened in my mother's eyes. She turned to my father, her voice trembling with hurt. "Mark, he trusted you, gave you everything, and you betrayed him." My father slammed his fist on the table in a rage. "This isn't over. I'll fight it." The lawyer shook his head negatively. "You have no chance. The instructions are impeccable. He thought everything through carefully. He knew what he was doing." For the first time in my life, I saw my father completely powerless. He sank back into the chair, his hands trembling, his pride broken. A heavy silence hung in the room. Everyone felt the weight of Grandpa's judgment. Leaving the office with the documents, I felt overwhelmed and humbled at the same time. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned it, but Grandpa saw something in me worthy of trust. He chose me not for strength or ambition, but for something more important, for love. This realization struck me more profoundly than any money. The inheritance was not just wealth, it was a responsibility, a message passed down through generations. And in that moment, I vowed to be worthy of this honor. After that day, my father stopped talking to me. He stormed out of the office without looking back and avoided me for several weeks. When we finally ran into each other, his words were full of bitterness. "Do you think you deserve this, Caleb?" "No, he just manipulated you, used you to punish me." I didn't argue. It was pointless. Nothing could dispel the bitterness in his heart. Deep down, my father probably knew the truth. Grandpa didn't leave the inheritance out of malice, but gave him a chance to prove his love, and my father missed it. My mother suffered. She loved both my father and my grandfather, and this conflict tore her apart. One evening, she came to my apartment and, sitting at the kitchen table, with eyes red from tears, said, "Your grandfather was right about you. You have his heart. You gave him the care he needed when no one else would. I don't know what will happen to your father, but know that I am proud of you." Her words brought more comfort than all the inheritance. She saw me, understood me. Now that the estate belonged to me, decisions had to be made. I could have bought a new house, expensive cars, lived in luxury. But every time I thought about it, Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. "A man's worth is not in his wealth, Caleb, but in how he treats his family." Then I understood what I had to do. The first step was to honor my grandfather's memory in a way that would last forever. I bought back a portion of the ranch land that had been sold, not the entire property, but enough to preserve a piece of his legacy. I restored the old barn, the very one where Grandpa had taught me to saddle a horse and mend a fence. At the entrance, I placed a plaque with Grandpa's name, not to boast of wealth, but so that everyone who came there would remember the man who built it with his own hands. Drawing on the wisdom of my ancestors, I established a scholarship fund dedicated to supporting local young men and women from families who had worked on ranches for generations. Recalling Grandpa's words that the future belonged to the younger generation, I realized that many families faced difficulties, unable to provide their children with opportunities beyond agriculture. Using a portion of the inheritance, I sought to ensure these children access to education, whether in agriculture, veterinary medicine, or any other field that would help them realize their dreams. As a token of respect and remembrance, each scholarship was named after my grandfather. I managed the remaining funds with prudence and wisdom. I kept enough for a modest existence, avoiding extravagance and excess. I did not want to repeat my father's path, who chased status and material possessions. My goal was to live in a way that would make Grandpa proud, demonstrating that money is merely a tool, not a measure of human worth. As for my father, his anger and resentment did not subside over time. He perceived my choice as a betrayal, as confirmation that I had taken his rightful place. I repeatedly tried to reconcile with my father, offering help and striving to mend what was broken, but all my attempts were rejected. "Keep your charity to yourself," my father once sharply retorted. "I don't need your pity." This caused pain, but over time, I learned to accept that some wounds don't heal, especially when pride and stubbornness stand in the way. My mother often visited me. She spent time on the restored ranch land, walking through the fields, sitting on the porch of the house, and sharing memories of her youth spent with Grandpa. She found peace and solace there, and so did I. Together, we cherished the memory of a dear man. Looking back, I realized that the lesson life taught me is crystal clear. Money has the power to reveal people's true nature, exposing their greed, fears, or, conversely, their love and generosity. Wealth did not corrupt Grandpa. It did not make him selfish. On the contrary, it gave him the opportunity to test those he held dear. My father failed that test, but it was in his failure that I found my calling. Grandpa's last will was not simply to leave me an inheritance, but to entrust me with the responsibility of spreading and upholding his values. Respect, kindness, and love, these were what held true value, surpassing any monetary sum. Grandpa believed I would remember this, even when others forgot. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the porch of the restored barn, gazing at the endless Wyoming sky that Grandpa and I once shared. In the stillness of the night, I hear his voice, calm and steady, reminding me of the lessons he taught me as a child, A man's worth is not measured by the amount of land he owns, Caleb, but by how he treats his family. And in those moments, I realized that the true inheritance is not the money, but the love Grandpa left behind, the lessons he instilled in my heart, and the example he set until his very last day. This is what I carry within me, what I will pass on to future generations when my time comes to leave my mark on this world. This is my story. It was not easy to live it, and it is not easy to share it with others. But I believe that my grandfather's lessons deserve to live on, inspiring and reminding us of eternal values.